Nimble 5e is a standalone RPG by Evan Diaz, the person who brought you Nimble from the year before. The difference between these two products is that the old Nimble was just a sort of pamphlet of rules changes that you could tack onto the D&D 5e rule set in order to streamline combat and other aspects of the game. Nimble 5e, which at the time of recording is crowdfunding on Backerkit, I'll leave links below, is a completely standalone game that doesn't require the D&D rules, yet is still compatible with all the monster and stat items and stuff from 5e. At this point, you've probably seen it a couple dozen times. A creator takes the now publicly owned Creative Commons D&D 5e rules and tries to improve on them. In most cases, they succeed since the underlying rules are so convoluted, but there was a recent success that I want to address up front when discussing Nimble 5e, and that recent success was DC 20 by YouTube's The Dungeon Coach, a reimagining of 5e rules that raised $2.2 million on Kickstarter with over 20,000 backers. Probably the best way to illustrate the difference between Nimble, DC 20, and vanilla D&D 5e rules is to put them on a scale or spectrum of crunch and complexity. This is essentially all based on my personal opinion and knowledge, so don't take this as absolute law, but I would put 5e D&D at around 7 on this scale of 1 to 10. Every time I suggest that 5e is moderately complex, I get a bunch of trolls in the comments telling me how tiny my brain is, and that's fine. If 5e is dead simple to you, that means you're super duper special and smart. As far as DC 20 goes, it does try to streamline and simplify, but not in any particularly dramatic way. The most notable mechanics tweaks are that you have 4 core attributes instead of 6, and you have 4 action points per turn, rather than different kinds of actions. Actually, this is a good time to mention that I conducted a full written interview with Nimble creator Evan Diaz on my newsletter, which I'll leave a link to down below, where I directly ask Evan, why Nimble and not DC 20? His response was basically that Nimble is even more streamlined and focused on quick, fun play than DC 20. And it's true. In the spectrum of complexity, Nimble, while managing to retain compatibility with the D&D 5e rules, more or less, clocks in at a much more approachable level than even DC 20. In this video, I want to walk you through 13 reasons why Nimble does, in fact, speed up your D&D game. And just to quickly address my clickbaity title for the video, there's no such thing as better or worse when basing your assessment of games on their complexity. DC 20 is not better than 5e because it's slightly simpler, nor is Nimble better than DC 20 for the same reason. Complexity comes down to personal preference. So if you want tighter gameplay with pretty much the fastest combat you can get while still being able to use all your 5e supplements and adventure books, then Nimble might be the best for you. But let's dive in. Okay, reasons why Nimble 5e does D&D better and faster than the vanilla 5e rules, at least in my opinion. 1. Simplified stats and skills. In Nimble, you have 5 main stats, 2 of which are designated as your key stats. Constitution is just folded into strength for the most part, and there are 10 skills as opposed to 18 in 5e. This is not really dumbing down the player experience as much as it's just consolidating what is already there and making it easier for new and casual players to play the game. And that's the thing here. If you're already a veteran of the 5e vanilla rules and you know them backwards and forwards, they may just be second nature to you and you don't need any streamlining or simplification. But you would probably be in the minority. Most people haven't completely internalized the whole mess of rules that is 5e and can play or run the game smoothly, which is why games like Nimble exist. 2. 3 kinds of saves. D&D has saves for all 6 core stats, but it can be confusing sometimes trying to parse out which stat to use. In Nimble, you have 3 kinds of saves, where you roll against either your strength, your dexterity, or the highest of your int, whiz, or charisma in what's called a will save. Again, just a strategic simplification that will grease the wheels a little bit. 3. Inventory slots. Every PC has inventory slots equal to 10 plus their strength to carry stuff. 1 inventory slot can hold a thing like a shield or a one-handed weapon. Larger items like two-handed weapons take 2 slots. In D&D, everything has a weight, and if you carry stuff that exceeds the weight of something like 15 times your strength score, then you're encumbered. It should go without saying that tracking the weight in pounds of everything you're carrying is extremely tedious. It is one of many instances in 5e where the rules don't know whether to be hand-wavy for the sake of enjoyment or meticulous and simulationist because someone in the design committee back in 2015 screamed louder than everyone else to make it that way. Inventory slots are more fun. Use it or lose it inspiration. Inspiration works the same between the two games, in which players are rewarded for good gameplay or a cool moment or whatever, and you spend the inspiration for a single reroll of a die. But in the case of Nimble, you lose that point of inspiration if you haven't used it before a long rest. This is a subtle but clever way of nudging the GM to give out inspiration more often, and for players to use those points rather than hold on to them. 5. Every level gives you cool stuff. One of the most notable improvements in Nimble over 5e is that you actually get something cool for your character at every level, rather than having to wait the usual 3 levels or so. At each level, your character gains HP, hit dice, a skill, and a class feature. You might actually be thinking that maybe this is too much, but let's be honest here. Modern Dungeons & Dragons is all about high power, high fantasy superheroism. This is Nimble's way of just leaning into that. Give the players what they want, a continuous feeling of growing power and ability throughout the course of the campaign. Don't make them wait 3 levels to get the next cool thing for their character. If you want more of a painful slog for your characters, go run Burning Wheel or something. No to hit rolls. In Nimble, you're not actually rolling once to determine whether or not you hit and then again to determine damage. You're just rolling once for damage, using the die listed for the weapon you're using. It is still possible to miss here because rolling a 1 means you actually miss and don't deal damage. When an attack involves multiple dice rolled, one of those dice is the primary die and will determine if the attack hits, misses, or crits. And crits explode, which means if you roll the highest number on that die, you 1, ignore enemy armor, and 2, roll again and add that to the total damage. And you keep rolling and adding as long as you keep rolling the highest number for that die. All this to say, you get all the fun of determining a hit or a miss and calculating damage with 1 roll instead of 2. Which in the big scheme of things does speed things up. Just for the sake of full coverage, I want to mention the fact that Nimble does not streamline everything. Conditions, for example, are largely the same as 5e, and this does remain a source of slowdown at the table. But I do think oversimplifying or removing conditions from the underlying rules would really start to affect 5e compatibility, so these remain largely untouched. Also, long rests and short rests are not revolutionary here. They are still very generous, which fits this kind of game. High fantasy, high heroism, generally not deadly. But back to the list. 7. Simplified gear stats. Let's compare a 5e gear table to a Nimble gear table. This goes back to what I said earlier about personal preference versus objective quality. Neither of these options is better than the other here. It just comes down to what kind of game you want to be playing. And really, if we're going to boil it down to its essential core, what do you want to spend your time doing at the table? Some people really enjoy nitpickery and minutia with gear in the middle of combat. Other people find it to be a waste of time and a hindrance to enjoyment. 8. Monsters don't have legendary actions or reactions. They just have actions. When you start fighting the mid and higher DC monsters in 5e, you run into the immediate problem of working through a bunch of different actions. Legendary actions, layer actions, reactions. It's customary in 5e books to describe actions with this much text, by the way. I don't think many people feel like waiting for the GM to refresh their memory about all these different actions in the middle of combat is actually fun. In Nimble, this is what a monster's stat block looks like. The creature has a list of actions, and if it's a boss level creature, it will have a feature for when it's bloodied as well as a thing it does when it's about to die. I think it's fair to say that this much reduction in textual description and in action types has the potential to reduce strategy and tactical considerations in combat, but never forget that dreadful silence when the GM has to look up and reread a giant monster stat block, or worse, the endless debating about this or that action between a GM and a player who thinks they know better. 9. Straightforward GM advice that works. I'm just showing you a draft document of Nimble right now, but honestly, these 2 pages have more GM advice for running encounters than I've ever seen in any 50 pages of official WotC book. That's because there are 2 different objectives here. Wizards of the Coast, a subsidiary of the publicly traded American toy company Hasbro, treats RPG books in the only way they know how, by assessing what people think of as maximum value and selling it to them while keeping costs as low as possible. And what people think of as valuable is page count. Here is the list of D&D 5e books published by WotC thus far with their page count. Each book pretty much has to clock in at or over 200 pages. There's a science to it. Unfortunately, to get to 200 pages in every case, they employ contract writers to crank out what can only be described as filler. Customers of official 5e products have been shelling out millions of dollars for books that each contain about 50 to 75 pages of good ideas and concepts and 125 to 150 pages of sawdust. Just absolute dross, which is the reason why I cover third-party and indie RPGs, because they operate on a different objective than Hasbro's games division subsidiary. They pretty much have to deliver quality content or they won't sell any copies. Nimble is a perfect example of this. Just 2 pages of GM combat tips are enough to turn any mediocre GM into a pretty good one. And to be fair to WotC, we wouldn't have Nimble without them, and we wouldn't have as big of an RPG industry without their 5e product line. But if you want to know where the best RPG content is, it's coming from small creators. Just look at this advice, it's gold. 10. Better approach to magical items. The philosophy that Nimble assumes on magical items is one I find really appealing. Basically, GMs should only introduce magical items into the game that create memorable moments or interesting choices. A lot of magical items in 5e don't fit this bill. Often they're just things that give a PC a little bit of power or combat prowess or whatever. But if you treat them as requiring one of these functions, they actually have meaning and gravity and impact. 11 classes streamlined. In my written interview with Nimble creator Evan Diaz, he unpacks a lot of what makes the reimagining of the D&D classes so good in Nimble, but we can also just take a look at a couple of examples for ourselves. The Berserker is the D&D barbarian basically, and that core function remains intact. But there are a couple of places where things get interesting. The first was mentioned earlier in that you get a cool new class ability for your character at every level. That just makes each of these classes so much more interesting to play. The second is this list of class abilities here, which every class has. This is where a lot of the design energy went in Nimble and where a lot of the innovation takes place. Each set of class abilities gives you distinct play options that stick to the theme of the class. For the Berserker, that theme is dealing damage and taking on more damage. And look, a lot of these class abilities and powers are not entirely revolutionary. Again, it's more about how they are organized and described and how they are dealt out to players. You just have a lot of class-specific options between the general and subclass abilities, and you keep getting more at every single level. 12. Boons as rewards. GMs have this option to give out a boon to a character instead of a stat increase when they gain a new level. Boons can also be given out as quest rewards and can be either permanent or temporary. What I like about these boons is that they are just more goodies for a GM to reward players with. Add these boons in the box that contains XP, gold, and inspiration points, and suddenly you have a very rewards-rich environment that players will find very enjoyable to play inside of. 13. Fewer but better spells. If you count up all the spells across all of 5e's official books, there are something like 673 of them. This is beyond unwieldy, and it's inevitable that a good number of these spells just suck and you'll never use them. Nimble's approach to magic is to reduce the spell list down to about 60 spells, but give each of them optional features depending on how much mana you spend on them. Again, not revolutionary, but just an optimal approach to streamlining magic. As far as damaging spells, there are 6 schools of magic, and they each have about 9 spells each, ranging from cantrip to tiers 1 through 9. Tiers, not spell levels. Just look at the spell descriptions here. Very straightforward and to the point. If you want more range or damage or special effects, you just spend more mana on the cast. It's as simple as that. And each of these spells comes with a card that explains the spell in its entirety. All right, here are my thoughts on Nimble so far. Still a fighty superhero game. One look at Nimble's class abilities make it abundantly clear that it's not trying to be anything fundamentally different than D&D 5e from a thematic or genre perspective. It's still a game where you essentially play as superhumanoids in a high fantasy, multiracial la-la land and only grow more and more powerful very quickly. That genre has mass appeal and Nimble isn't trying to change it at all. Even if the rules are tightened up and streamlined about as much as they possibly can while still retaining 5e compatibility, you're still committing to playing in sessions revolving around encounters of violence to resolve a narrative. There's no way to easily change this, for example by trying to add a social encounter mechanic, since the nature of the genre is baked into the mechanics itself, specifically the class abilities. Everything plays fast. Most of the things I've listed in this video are features designed to speed speed up things at the table, because that is the single worst thing about playing WotC's 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. The waiting, the silence, the people pulling out their phones because rules are being adjudicated. The whole point of Nimble is revealed in the very name of the game. Relatively low cost. At the time of recording, WotC is about to release a modest update to 5e, and everyone is abuzz about the cover art for their 3 core books. Those books will probably retail for $80 each, and they say that this time their Dungeon Master's Guide will actually be useful. This means that to buy the game of Dungeons & Dragons version 5.5, people will spend $240 plus tax for 3 books. No PDFs, no bonus content for a virtual tabletop, no cards, no dice. Just 3 probably glue-bound books. Nimble will clock in at or around $100 if you want to get all the cards and everything. And just the 3 books with PDFs will cost less than 1 D&D book. And this is for a game that you will actually play and enjoy, rather than try to read until your eyes glaze over and then actually learn from watching YouTube tutorials that explain it all to you in a much more efficient fashion. Still 5e compatible. Nimble is still largely compatible with other 5e products. I wouldn't say that it's 100% compatible because you have a different approach to magic and action economy, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist to convert those aspects of 5e stuff to Nimble's framework. So yeah, on a personal level, I don't play super heroic fantasy, but I am going to get the Nimble box set so that I can further study what good game design looks like. And if I were asked by friends to play Nimble, I would. This is the exact level of complexity and engagement I would want out of a game of quote D&D. I can't do long stat blocks and dozens of pages of spell descriptions anymore. What are your thoughts on Nimble and on modernizing and streamlining the genre? Leave your comments down below. I've left links for stuff. Thanks for watching. See ya.